Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy, the show about the health of democracy and citizenship, both in America and around the world. On July 4th this year, I talked to the Iranian-American writer Roya Hakakian about the health of democracy in America. And her report was reasonably optimistic. She believes that America still has much to teach the rest of the world about democracy, and she's relatively optimistic about the future of democracy in America. I'm not sure everyone shares Hakakian's optimism about both the history and the future of democracy in America. And my guest on today's show, Darryl Pinckney, is a longtime fiction writer, essayist, commentator on America, particularly on identity politics, sexual, racial in America. Darryl, welcome to How to Fix Democracy. Real honor to have you on the show. We first met at lunch in New York City a couple of months ago, and I've been busily consuming your work ever since. Darryl, where are we when it comes to the state of democracy in post-Trumpian America?
I find it difficult to say. For one thing, the engagement with the news over the past 5 years, I think it's difficult to say because so many things are going on at the same time. And so just as you have the Republican legislatures making a very concerted effort in state after state after state to restrict access to the polls, you have organizations with very sophisticated responses to it, and the federal government opposed to these kind of measures. I think what's new is that there's no disguise on either side about what they're doing, why, and what's at stake. The Republicans are not bothering with much language of to say that what they're doing is not really what they're doing. They're rather open that they want to, control elections. And this is the only way to do it, is to stop the numbers from showing up. The most recent elections demonstrated that the numbers tend to be on the side of the Democratic Party when it's cast as the party of change or inclusion or turning a corner or anything new. The Republican Party less so, in that its traditional wing is rather powerless. And I would say the news within the Republican Party is the attempt of some of the old hands to position themselves with a new activist base that they hadn't quite understood or predicted. What it represents. I think that Trump brought to, I'm not making really any sense, but what I'm trying to say is so much is going on at the moment, it's hard to see where it's going to land. It's hard to predict the outcome, but this has always been true of American politics. It's only in retrospect that things seemed inevitable or inexorable, but actually the outcomes, even when power is, wins this episode or ends this battle, the whole thing is long, is this long story. And so it's impossible to say where things are going really. If you think of that war is politics by other means, Foucault was determined to kind of invert it. Politics is war by other means. And so I think that people are beginning to accept the sense of not the polarized United States, but forces always in conflict United States. I think
Darryl, what do you make of some critics of the Republican Party who believe that they're really trying to dismantle, do away, kill American democracy? Do you believe there's truth to that?
Well, no. I mean, this is a new chapter in a very old struggle. And the conservative approach hasn't changed since our founding fathers, that voting is not a right, it's a privilege, and you must demonstrate that you have earned this privilege by being a good citizen, by showing that you will be a good citizen, that, you know, inclusiveness or being included in the political body isn't a birthright. You know, it's a sort of social gift in a way.
Carol Anderson, who has been on the show, I know you're familiar with her work,
yeah,
suggests that within the Republican Party, there's a belief that voting is almost a racial right, that in their minds, both consciously and unconsciously, they don't want people of other skins, particularly African Americans, to vote.
Well, of course, you know, because they immediately assume that they're voting in opposition to them. What we have with Trump that we haven't had so openly in certainly 100 years is this kind of white identity that is rather angrily protective of a status quo, being sort of white supremacy. It hasn't been needed before or in a long time, or hasn't sort of been provoked into expressing itself in this language. But in some ways, it's a kind of self-pitying reaction to identity politics at large. What is our stake in it? But it's also a sense of the white importance lessening somehow. This, what Du Bois called personal whiteness, this kind of loss of status. So I think that is this white identity, and then the suspicion of anyone else outside of it is a product of sort of Trump realignments, Trump corruption, Trump destructions, and this is what it's left the Republican Party with, in a rather bad situation, I would think, because there's not much appeal to that in the long run or over the long haul, you know, and it has a sort of minority appeal, but it's as though the Republican Party had been taken hostage, not by the Tea Party, but by people who have dislodged even the Tea Party when it comes to not making sense. Speaking of not making sense.
Darryl, our third series in the How to Fix Democracy series is focused on the challenge and opportunities, the ideal of citizenship. Is it possible to think of oneself as a citizen in 21st century America, premised, at least in terms of one's identity, on racial politics, on being white or indeed black?
Again, these are arguments that have been with us since the founding moment. You know, what is citizenship? And you get one reading of it, and now we have sort of two more that have branched off. You have the so-called progressives who think that the Constitution and the, say, Declaration of Independence are compromised documents already because of the presence and power of slaveholders in the composition of them. But on the other hand, you have what it has always functioned to be, which is an instrument that enlarges citizenship, that has been interpreted down through the generations as this means by which people can be included, you know, can be defined as citizens, that they do have a share. So yes, I think it's possible to be a citizen. Race is not irrelevant in that if you are a race somebody objects to or wants to exclude, you're subjected to policies of voter suppression, things like that.
Darryl, where do we learn?
But in the abstract, it doesn't matter, no. Sorry.
sorry, Darryl, where do we learn, or how do we learn to be citizens? Is this something born into us? Is it in educational terms? Is it through family?
Well, there's all of that. You know, we can't. No sociologist has ever been able to figure out, or a Marxist has ever been able to tell us why people vote against what we consider their interests. So who are we? But you know, vote against what they consider their interests is partly family traditions. It's so many things. But certainly a lot of it is learned. I can remember in the high school I went to, suburban high school, the student government elections offered a real voting equipment, voting booths, things like that, that actually taught you how to these machines, how to vote. Any kind of education you have in that way makes you more comfortable exercising the right to vote, knowing what to do. In the early civil rights days, people like Ella Baker and Vernon Jordan sponsored projects that went down and taught people how to vote, what to do, civics that they never had at home or in anything like a school. So it doesn't just teach you the mechanics of what to do and how to do it. It also makes you feel that you are a part of it, that it belongs to you and you're not intimidated, that this precinct is not off limits, that it's not, it doesn't belong to someone else. It is yours. So a lot of what learning to be a citizen is getting over the feeling of being excluded, that this is not for you. So people now are very, I don't know if the voter suppression laws will work insofar as limiting early voting, drive-in voting, same-day voting, everything that helps working people. I think that people are so offended by these things and see so clearly what happens when you do turn out that they will anyway. I think that these voter suppression measures are in some ways futile, and the policy of a sort of deranged wing of the Republican Party playing to a false sense of what its base wants, because anything people say politically doesn't correspond to their support for infrastructure spending, for healthcare, if you don't call it Obamacare. Nobody has an interest in turning the clock back, except for the Republicans who want to stay in power or regain power. And I think the moment has passed them in that sense. But it does go back to something else, which is, I think gerrymandering is a real danger, drawing the districts in the first place. And also the politicized courts are also a big danger, because it means that the relief isn't there, and is not going to be there. And so it all depends on legislative measures. So we're coming back to what America often, the situation it always finds itself in electoral politics and race, which is a conflict between states and federal authority. And by our design, states run the elections. Each state decides how to run their elections, and the federal government only intervenes in extraordinary circumstances, such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which, because 19 states had such a history of discrimination and racism, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 provided that they needed pre-clearance, these states, to any change they made in how they conducted elections. They needed to come under get approval from courts of appeal or some sort of federal body like that. And that's what the Roberts Court, that's the provision the Roberts Court struck down as being no longer necessary. And as soon as that provision was struck down, a number of states rushed ahead with voter ID laws that are rather hard for the poor and the elderly and unhoused. But again, this dispute, this conflict has always been a part of electoral politics, meaning racial politics in the US, because it's the states that sort of preserved white supremacy or fought to most actively, and federal intervention, whether it be the first Reconstruction or after the passing of civil rights legislation in the 60s, the second Reconstruction, it's called, in the 70s. The federal, and so the John Lewis Act would put this provision back to a certain extent, pre-clearance.
Darryl, where do you place the Black Lives Matter movement in the history of American democracy and citizenship? Is it just another chapter in this ongoing
Well, it is another chapter
narrative, or is it something that will reflect a profound, you hope, a profound change in the nature of things, and particularly in eliminating or at least confronting racism, particularly institutional racism?
Well, certainly it is another episode, but it is a very profound one, as you say. For one thing, it was clear in Ferguson what social media could do when it came to helping people to organize, and therefore it decentralized the movement to a certain extent, so that Black Lives Matter doesn't have a spokesman the way we remember Black organizations having spokespeople or heads. We know that there are founders of Black Lives Matter, but they don't preside over an organization. It's an umbrella term for lots of different efforts and organizations and events, and so yes, it matters in that it kind of broke things open, and anyone can sort of do it, or take part, or find groups to work with and be in touch with. So in that sense, it spread things and used new tools. And the fact that the protests last summer were worldwide is a very important thing. It's just that, yes, things can go away. The Scottsboro demonstrations of the 1930s were worldwide, but after a number of decades, not many Americans could tell you who the Scottsboro brothers were. So it's also education and what comes down to us. It's hard to imagine Black Lives Matter being lost as a chapter of American history, but we don't know what's coming that may sort of, cover it, so to speak. And the way that World War II changed or was such a break from what had happened in the 1930s and the Depression and politically in America. So that can't be predicted, but certainly, yes, it does matter. Well, it is very important, yes.
Darryl, you mentioned education a couple of times. You were educated at Columbia University. You've been in and out of the university ever since. You know it inside very well. When we had lunch a couple of months ago in New York, you suggested that you were in some ways troubled by the cultural atmosphere within universities. Have they become institutions which are not preparing our young, educated people to become citizens? Are they limiting people? Are they teaching intolerance?
Well, it would be, again, hard to say, since there are so many educational institutions in the United States and not all of them are the same. Even though,
should we choose our elite universities, the Harvards and Yales and Columbias of the world?
The problem with education, with college education in America in general, is that because high schools tend to be so bad, the work is done in colleges, and it's graduate schools that sort of determine people's future. I do think that liberal arts colleges and undergraduate colleges that are part of large universities with enormous research facilities and distinguished faculty have certainly been allowed to stray from what I think of as what universities are supposed to do, or what the college experience is supposed to do. Firstly, they're not safe spaces. Certainly the schools are meant to stand in the place of parents and protect the child and feed the child and guarantee the child's health and safety. But they're not intellectually safe spaces. They're not supposed to be, not at the undergraduate level. You're supposed to sort of read and listen and learn to think. And I think that a lot of nonsense. I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I'm sort of groping for the words because the examples come up more quickly than what they mean. So why do you have a separate Black graduation at a place like Harvard? What's the point? Why are you at Harvard? I found that sort of really silly. Or the Black playwright Adrienne Kennedy, who taught at Harvard. She's a very experimental avant-garde playwright of the 60s. Really interesting figure. But a Black student playwright group announced a boycott of a play of hers that was being revived because the director was white. I find that kind of thing really silly, and I don't think students should be sort of allowed to make such fools of themselves in quite that way. I know that's a harsh thing to say, but censorship does not honor the dead. And that's all that kind of thing is. Triggers, I don't believe in. No, this word doesn't hurt you. No, this should not be canceled. This is class discussion, classroom discussion. It's all sort of, again, more about sort of power dynamics in the classroom and within the university, and not what I think are the purposes of university education or education at that level at all. I found a lot of what was said at Princeton last summer very disturbing. I don't think that a peer review of faculty research is at all acceptable in any case, even if you are sort of, who are you to sort of be the authority to vet someone for racism? You're sort of exchanging.
Which example at Princeton, Darryl, are you talking about in particular?
There was a letter that went around last summer about sort of certain reforms at Princeton.
Right.
And so it went with renaming things, the Woodrow Wilson School of Foreign Relations, the Woodrow Wilson Residence, things of that nature, and was tied to sort of other debates then going on. And so in a very long letter about reforms, one of the proposals was for a peer review committee to vet the research of faculty members. I don't know how far it got, but just that it was sort of in this published list of 44 proposals, I found rather shocking. And I don't know how tied it was to the argument over the 1619 project, which is in the first instance, Hannah Nicole Jones, or is it Hannah Nicole Smith? Ooh, I'm sorry.
Which is another story altogether, sort of from the other side, right?
Yes, she was sort of arguing not just about 1619, and Henry Louis Gates pointed out that actually Blacks were in North America long before 1619 because there are African cemeteries in Florida dating from the late 16th century. So she means in the English-speaking North America, fine. But she had then at one point said that the Revolutionary War was fought to preserve slavery. And Sean Lewentz, a professor at Princeton, very much disagreed. Nell Painter, another distinguished historian, also disagreed with her, but refused to sign Sean Lewentz's letter, sort of denouncing this project, because she thought that, well, even though this young lady is a journalist, not a historian, you can't restrict who's interested in history or tell them how to do it. And I sort of agree with that position. She was denied tenure at her alma mater in North Carolina, Hannah Nicole Jones or Smith, but Howard hired her. And, it's a disgrace that she was denied tenure, even though I very much disagree with her. She's, as distinguished, if not more, than people.
How important is all this, though? It's obviously academic politics, Darryl, but are we ill preparing our young to become citizens when they grow up as voters, as participants, if the universities have become places of intolerance
Well,
and censorship?
those are sort of wasted chances, and very much so, since your 4 years in college are the time when you can sort of test what you think, or find out what you think before routine convention or more targeted kind of education takes over your life. So yes, it's too bad they're not encouraged to think more freely, or that the thinking they're encouraged to do is activist directed in a very sort of narrow way. Politically, I'm very much for Black Lives Matter, but culturally, not necessarily. And it's very frustrating, because then you find yourself, oh, you're an old person, or sort of or out of it. But I understand James Baldwin's loathing for liberals during McCarthyism, because I find in cancellation culture, I don't know what else to call it, a lot of cowardice on the part of people in charge of institutions, boards of trustees, directors of museums, opera houses, all those sort of things, ready to throw people under the bus, often experts, often white guys, often older white guys, in the name of change, but they're really just afraid of this thing called the younger staff, or the staff. It's this kind of seizure of power by the bottom from the top, but the very top goes along with the bottom in order to stay on top. And so you get sort of rich women at board meetings talking about doing the work. What could be more grotesque?
Darryl, you mentioned the internet earlier. You suggested that in the Black Lives Matter movement, it created a leaderless organization, which I assume you think is a good thing. Has the internet broadly, the Facebooks and Twitters of the world, have they been good for democracy and citizenship?
Well, it's hard to sort of follow all these stories about platforms and things like that. I don't want to blame the means for the means that people get out their message for the message. Again, I don't think that. But on the other hand, if you're saying, should Facebook be responsible and not have certain platforms? Okay, fine. I can understand that. Or certainly not even politically, because it crosses racial lines. There's a sort of stubborn stupidity about the vaccine among white right-wing people, and there's a stubborn stupidity about the vaccine among a certain kind of Black cultural nationalists. Both of them go back to sort of suspicion of control, or the government sort of up to something or intervening. They share the same kind of paranoid hostility to rules and regulations. But that's not the fault of the technology. I don't necessarily think. So I don't know if I would sort of blame all these things. Again, I'm not sure they work, or how far they've succeeded. And what can be done about it. We're not all watching Walter Cronkite anymore, gathered around the same story. Too many stories are coming in with different sources, and not everyone trusts them. And in a way, everyone's sharing the same narrative. That maybe is gone. And that may be the thing we have to learn to live with.
Well, the reason I asked the question is last year I saw you curated a very interesting conversation with the New York Review of Books about the state of local journalism and the state of media. And it touches on democracy. The rise of Facebook and Twitter, of course, has gone with a crisis of local journalism, of smaller newspapers and publications. Do we need a more vibrant and profitable media, a curated media, to maintain democracy? Does that worry you?
Yes, it does. I mean, you know, sort of the great newspapers were great in a particular time because of the personalities who were there, either running things or the person running things got the right people. And so to a large extent, that sort of thing is personality driven. It's the vision of someone. And when you attack this kind of auteurism in favor of committees for public safety from institution to institution, you weaken the ability of someone with this kind of vision to lead a fight using this particular cultural vehicle. So yes, I think that has had an effect. One thing that has happened, and I'm perhaps not the best judge of it, but I'll say it anyway, is that a lot of places they've become all the same. You know, you can find things to read in any magazine, but pretty much for the general reader, they're all the same. And this kind of loss of personality, you know, that ideas have some kind of life and personality, I think is a missed chance to recruit people on the side of, you know, listening and reasoning. And also identity politics has encouraged a tendency to only want to see what you already believe, read what you already believe, find yourself in the story. We're not encouraged to take a journey of any kind anymore, whether of the head, of the heart, you know, or to sort of, you know, sort of empathize with strangers. So I think, yes, we've lost a certain cosmopolitanism that democracy needs. You know, it's not only, well, yeah, you know, yes. Which is a shame, because one thing social media can do is export these sorts of things to different regions and locations. For a number of years, centuries, the national press in the United States succeeded by telling people what was going on in New York City. It's not the case anymore, but everything that used to go on in New York City that you identified with New York City has been exported to every other community in the country. And so you don't really sort of need the metropolis as this arbiter of taste. You know, that kind of thing is gone because there's so many fronts. But as a kind of warehouse or clearinghouse of ideas, and where people meet and, you know, the unpredictable happens, that's a loss.
Darryl, finally, you talked about the need for cosmopolitanism to enrich democracy. I asked the same question to Margaret Atwood when she appeared on our show earlier this year. Do you think that's the role of fiction writers like yourself, connoisseurs of literature? Do you bring that, or is it your, I wouldn't say responsibility, but perhaps role and opportunity to bring that kind of cosmopolitanism to educating people about what citizenship should mean and what democracy can be?
I think if you had that as a stated intention, people would flee from you. It's your contribution to the ongoing surrounding discussion that's, you know, it's the variety and the choices that define this cosmopolitanism, not a particular work in that sense. I was reading not so long ago Salman Rushdie's collection of essays, Languages and Truth, and it was very refreshing because it sort of was very concerned with the pleasures of literature, the pleasures of storytelling, you know, the magic of art. And that's another thing that I think is unfortunate in the generational changes. You know, I grew up thinking of artists as a kind of priesthood or something, you know, a rather special category that had a duty or responsibility to the society in what we expressed or asked people to examine. And so if the arts are just another profession, that kind of sacred function sort of goes away. So I think that you know, the arts connect us not only to one another but also to human history, and that's a bigger word than cosmopolitanism.
Well, Darryl, you may not be an ideologist of cosmopolitanism, certainly in theory. I think in practice you are. I want to thank you so much for a really enriching and honest conversation, so honest and so refreshing. Thank you so much. Keep well, and love to have you back on How to Fix Democracy in the future.
And I'll think of everything I wish I said afterward. But again, thank you for giving me a chance to speak.